When I stumbled upon the old cabin, it wasn't much more than a forgotten structure hidden deep in the woods. On a whim, I bought it at a quirky local auction for just 25 cents, more of a joke than an investment. But the cabin had secrets. Over the course of a year, I learned its land sat on an undeveloped, mineral-rich area, and when the town announced a new luxury development nearby, the value of my humble cabin skyrocketed to $10 million. I thought I had struck generational gold, but then came the twist. The local Homeowners Association, HOA, which I didn't even realize governed the land, suddenly claimed the cabin and land fell under their jurisdiction. They argued that because of overlooked covenants and deed restrictions from decades ago, they owned rights to my property. What followed was a whirlwind of lawyers, fine print, and the startling realization that sometimes what you think you own, you may not truly control.
The power of unexpected opportunities is one of the most fascinating lessons we can take from this story of buying a cabin for just 25 cents. Often, when people think of opportunity, they imagine something grand, well-packaged and obvious, a promotion, a big business deal, or a life-changing connection. But the reality is that many of the greatest opportunities arrive quietly, disguised as something ordinary, overlooked, or even unimportant. The cabin that cost a quarter is a perfect example. At first glance, it was a joke purchase, more symbolic than serious. No one in the room could have imagined it would one day be worth $10 million. Yet this shows us that value is not always visible on the surface, and the ability to spot potential where others see nothing is one of the most important skills in life. Educationally, this point teaches us to shift our perspective about the nature of opportunity. Opportunities are not always loud or glamorous. They are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone curious enough or bold enough to explore them. The cabin teaches us that small, almost laughable beginnings can lead to astonishing results. In practical terms, this means that in everyday life, the things we dismiss as worthless, a dusty book at a yard sale, an empty lot in a forgotten neighborhood, a casual idea shared over coffee, could hold enormous potential if we train ourselves to look deeper. This principle applies beyond real estate. Think about early investments in technology companies that seemed like quirky side projects at the time, or individuals who pursued hobbies that eventually turned into global businesses. The lesson is consistent. What matters is not how an opportunity looks today, but what it could become tomorrow. Another layer to this is the mindset required to benefit from unexpected opportunities. Many people only pursue things when success feels guaranteed, but opportunities like the cabin are rarely guaranteed. They demand curiosity, creativity, and sometimes a willingness to take risks that don't make sense to others. Buying a property for 25 cents might have seemed foolish to most people, but without that small act of whimsy, the value would have remained undiscovered. This highlights the importance of being open-minded, because often opportunities are missed, not because they aren't there, but because people are too rigid in their thinking to recognize them. There's also an educational insight about timing. The cabin was not valuable immediately. It became valuable a year later when circumstances changed. This demonstrates that opportunities are not static. They evolve depending on shifts in society, economics, technology, and even community development. Something useless today can be priceless tomorrow. In practical life, this means we must learn patience and vision. The challenge is not only to see what is, but to imagine what could be, and then position ourselves to benefit when the right conditions arrive. Furthermore, the story reminds us of the importance of resourcefulness. An opportunity doesn't just grow on its own, it must be nurtured. The cabin could have been ignored even after it was purchased. It was through investigation, recognition of the land's hidden value, and awareness of the broader development that its true worth was realized. This means that simply stumbling into opportunities is not enough. One must actively cultivate them, invest time into understanding them, and sometimes make strategic choices to bring out their full potential. Finally, the deeper educational point is that unexpected opportunities are everywhere, but they require us to develop a certain way of seeing the world. It is easy to walk past something ordinary without a second thought, but those who train themselves to look with curiosity, who ask questions others don't ask, and who take small chances when others laugh, are the ones who unlock hidden treasures. The 25-cent cabin story is not just about real estate luck, it is a metaphor for life. The most extraordinary doors often come disguised as ordinary walls, and it is only when we pay attention, dare to take a chance, and nurture what others dismiss that we discover just how much value can hide in plain sight.
The reality of property ownership is far more complex than most people realize, and the story of the 25-cent cabin turning into a $10 million asset only to face a claim from the HOA reveals just how fragile the idea of ownership can be. Many people assume that once they buy something and their name is on a deed or title, they fully and unquestionably own it. In theory, that should be true, but in practice, ownership is tied to a web of legal, financial, and organizational structures that can either protect or threaten what you believe is yours. Understanding this reality is not just important for investors or property owners, it is essential knowledge for anyone who wants to safeguard their financial future. One of the first lessons in the reality of property ownership is the concept of rights versus control. Having your name on a deed gives you certain rights, but those rights can be limited by other agreements or entities, such as homeowners associations, zoning boards, or even prior deed restrictions that may have been written decades earlier. In the cabin story, the HOA stepped forward and claimed ownership rights based on covenants tied to the land. This is a classic example of how fine print, often overlooked at the time of purchase, can later emerge as a powerful force. What feels like true ownership can, under legal scrutiny, turn into something conditional. Another important layer is that ownership of property does not mean absolute freedom. Property laws exist at multiple levels, local, state, and federal, and each layer can impose rules that affect what an owner can or cannot do. For example, a person might technically own a piece of land, but still be restricted from building on it due to environmental regulations or zoning laws. Similarly, owning a property in a neighborhood governed by an HOA might mean you must follow rules about what color your house can be painted or whether you can park an RV in your driveway. These rules may seem minor compared to the ownership itself, but they highlight a critical educational point. Ownership is not the same as autonomy. The land, building, or cabin may have your name on it, but the control of how it can be used is often shared with or dictated by others. Financial realities add another layer to this discussion. Many people think of property ownership as a path to stability and wealth, but they underestimate the ongoing obligations tied to it. Taxes, insurance, maintenance costs, and fees from governing associations can turn what looks like an asset into a liability if they are ignored. In some cases, unpaid property taxes or HOA dues can even lead to foreclosure, meaning you could lose your property despite having legally purchased it. This teaches us that ownership is not simply about acquiring something, it is about continuously protecting it through awareness, compliance, and financial responsibility. The educational takeaway here is the importance of due diligence. Before buying a property, it is critical to research every aspect of the deed, title, and governing rules. This includes checking for liens, easements, zoning restrictions, or association covenants that might impact ownership. The cabin story demonstrates what can happen when this step is skipped or underestimated. While the outcome was dramatic in this case, similar situations happen every day on smaller scales, such as when a buyer discovers too late that their property has shared driveway rights with a neighbor, or that underground utilities limit where they can build. These rules might seem minor compared to the ownership itself, but they highlight a critical educational point. Ownership is not the same as autonomy. The land, building, or cabin may have your name on it, but the control of how it can be used is often shared with or dictated by others. Financial realities add another layer to this discussion. Many people think of property ownership as a path to stability and wealth, but they underestimate the ongoing obligations tied to it. Taxes, insurance, maintenance costs, and fees from governing associations can turn what looks like an asset into a liability if they are ignored. In some cases, unpaid property taxes or HOA dues can even lead to foreclosure, meaning you could lose your property despite having legally purchased it. This teaches us that ownership is not simply about acquiring something. It is about continuously protecting it through awareness, compliance, and financial responsibility. The educational takeaway here is the importance of due diligence. Before buying a property, it is critical to research every aspect of the deed, title, and governing rules. This includes checking for liens, easements, zoning restrictions, or association covenants that might impact ownership. The cabin story demonstrates what can happen when this step is skipped or underestimated. While the outcome was dramatic in this case, similar situations happen every day on smaller scales, such as when a buyer discovers too late that their property has shared driveway rights with a neighbor, or that underground utilities limit where they can build. Beyond the technicalities, there is also a deeper reality. Ownership is less about the physical asset and more about the framework of laws, agreements, and responsibilities surrounding it. This is why lawyers, title companies, and inspectors are such an important part of real estate transactions. They are not just there for formality, they are there to uncover hidden details that can determine whether your ownership is secure or at risk. Ultimately, the reality of property ownership reminds us that buying something tangible like a cabin, a house, or even a piece of land is only the beginning. True ownership requires knowledge of the systems that govern it, the foresight to anticipate potential challenges, and the discipline to manage obligations that come with it. Without this awareness, even the most remarkable asset, like a cabin that skyrockets in value, can become vulnerable to claims or disputes. The lesson here is clear. Ownership is not just a transaction. It is an ongoing responsibility to understand and navigate the invisible structures that surround your property.
The rise and risk of sudden wealth is a theme that resonates well beyond the story of a cabin bought for 25 cents and later valued at $10 million. On the surface, this seems like a dream scenario, the kind of windfall that changes lives forever. But with that dream comes a reality that many people fail to anticipate. Sudden wealth is not just about gaining money, it is about managing responsibility, expectations, and challenges that often appear as quickly as the fortune itself. The educational lesson here is that wealth, especially when it arrives unexpectedly, can be both an incredible opportunity and a potential trap. One of the first aspects to understand is that sudden wealth magnifies both strengths and weaknesses. For someone who is disciplined, patient, and informed, a windfall can create long-term security and growth. But for someone unprepared, impulsive, or uninformed, it can lead to mismanagement, conflict, and even financial ruin. There are countless stories of lottery winners who lost everything within a few years, not because the money disappeared on its own, but because they were unprepared for the responsibility of managing it. In the case of the cabin, the sudden increase in value created not only excitement, but also legal complications, unexpected attention, and the risk of losing it all to a Homeowners Association claim. This highlights a universal truth. Wealth attracts challenges, and sudden wealth can attract them even faster. Another important element is the psychological impact of sudden wealth. When people imagine becoming wealthy, they often picture only the benefits: freedom, comfort, and security. Yet the reality is that wealth can also bring stress, anxiety, and pressure. The person who bought the cabin for a quarter may have thought it was a lighthearted purchase at first, but once it became a multi-million-dollar asset, every decision carried far greater weight. Should it be sold immediately? Should it be developed? Should it be held as an investment? These decisions are not simple, and the fear of making the wrong choice can create immense pressure. Educationally, this shows us that money does not remove problems, it changes their nature. Instead of worrying about paying bills, a person might worry about protecting assets, paying taxes, or defending ownership against legal claims. The social dynamics around sudden wealth are also worth examining. Wealth often changes how others perceive and treat you. Friends, family, and even strangers may begin to see you differently, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with jealousy, and sometimes with a sense of entitlement. The cabin story illustrates this through the involvement of the HOA, but in real life, sudden wealth often brings requests for loans, expectations of generosity, or even disputes over entitlement. The educational takeaway here is the importance of boundaries. Without clear boundaries and a plan for handling relationships, wealth can strain or even destroy connections with others. There is also the structural risk of sudden wealth. A fortune that appears quickly can disappear just as quickly if it is not safeguarded. Taxes, legal claims, and poor investments can erode wealth faster than most people anticipate. In the cabin case, the very existence of an HOA claim demonstrated how quickly millions of dollars in perceived value could be put at risk. This highlights the necessity of professional guidance. Lawyers, financial advisors, and accountants become not luxuries, but necessities when large sums of money are involved. Education here lies in understanding that protecting wealth is just as important as acquiring it, and without systems of protection in place, even the largest fortune can be temporary. Finally, the rise and risk of sudden wealth teaches us a lesson about values. Wealth does not inherently bring happiness or fulfillment. It can provide options and comfort, but it does not guarantee purpose or stability. The cabin story, while extraordinary, is a metaphor for how quickly circumstances can shift. A simple, cheap purchase became a life-changing asset, but with that came battles, stress, and uncertainty. The lesson is that wealth, whether it grows gradually or appears suddenly, must be accompanied by wisdom, patience, and self-awareness. Without those qualities, the risks of wealth can outweigh its benefits.
The bigger lesson about ownership versus control is perhaps the most important takeaway from the story of the 25-cent cabin. At first glance, buying something with your own money feels like the ultimate form of ownership. You hold the deed, your name is on the title, and the property feels like it belongs to you. But when the Homeowners Association stepped in and claimed rights over the cabin, the illusion of absolute ownership was shattered. This shows us that what many people call ownership is often just permission to use something within the boundaries set by larger systems. The distinction between ownership and control is subtle, but deeply educational, because it explains why people sometimes lose what they thought was theirs, and why true ownership requires more than simply paying for something. The first element to understand is that ownership exists within a framework of laws and agreements that define what you can and cannot do with your property. You may buy a house, but zoning laws can prevent you from opening a business in it. You may purchase land, but environmental protections might stop you from cutting down trees or building on it. In the cabin case, the HOA covenants, rules buried in decades-old agreements, limited the buyer's control despite their technical ownership. The broader point is that ownership is not about holding a piece of paper. It is about understanding the rights, limitations, and conditions that come attached to it. If you fail to understand those conditions, you may discover too late that your control is far less than you imagined. Another key lesson is that control often matters more than ownership in practice. Imagine two people. One owns a property outright but cannot develop or sell it because of restrictions, while the other leases a property but has full freedom to operate a business on it and generate income. The second person may not legally own the property, but in reality they control it in a way that creates more value. The cabin story highlights this difference perfectly. While the buyer technically owned the cabin, the HOA had the power to challenge that ownership, limiting the buyer's ability to fully control or benefit from the property. This demonstrates that in real estate and in life, control can be more powerful than ownership itself. There is also an educational insight in the way systems of governance interact with ownership.
Many people assume that once they own something, they are completely independent, but true independence is rare in modern society. Homeowners associations, municipalities, state governments, and even federal agencies all exercise forms of authority that can override personal ownership. This doesn't mean ownership is meaningless. It means ownership must be understood as conditional, nested within larger structures. A wise owner educates themselves about those structures before investing too much energy or money, while an unprepared owner risks losing their asset to rules they never knew existed. Financial responsibility further complicates the question of ownership versus control. Even when you hold a clear title, you must pay taxes, fees, and sometimes association dues. Failure to do so can result in liens or foreclosures that strip you of the very property you thought you owned. In other words, you might own your house, but if you stop paying property taxes, the government has the control to take it away. This illustrates a broader truth. Ownership is only as strong as your ability to meet the obligations that come with it. The deeper lesson is that ownership without awareness is fragile. It is not enough to acquire assets. One must also understand the rules, responsibilities, and power structures that shape how those assets can be used. True ownership combines the legal right to hold something with the practical ability to control it. Without both, ownership becomes symbolic rather than real. The cabin story is a vivid example of this principle because it reveals the tension between personal belief in ownership and the reality of external control. Ultimately, the educational takeaway is that ownership and control are not the same, and anyone seeking security in their investments or possessions must learn to navigate the systems that influence them. Whether it is property, wealth, or even intellectual creations, the lesson remains constant. What you think you own may not fully belong to you unless you also understand and secure control. Awareness of this distinction empowers individuals to make better decisions, protect their assets, and avoid the painful surprise of losing what they assumed was theirs.